Hello, hello, everyone, and welcome to Royal Ontario Museum Google Plus Hangout. I'm Ray Osman. I'm Managing Director of ROM Ancient Cultures. And today I have with me three amazing Egyptologists. Try to say that 3 times fast. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of research on mummies here at the ROM and then current research that's going on right now. If you'd like to join us, if you're joining us live on the Hangout and you've got questions for us, you can tweet them to us at #AskROM, and we'll be able to pick those up and have our experts respond to you right away. So first I'd like to turn things over to Gayle Gibson, who's an Egyptologist and a member of our learning department here at the ROM.
Hi there. It's really nice to be talking about our mummies. I've been visiting them here at the ROM since I was a little girl, but our oldest mummy has actually been in Canada since 1859. So he's a very old Canadian. We have a lot of history with mummies, and some of it's been very scientific. We had the very first modern scientific medical autopsy of a mummy in the world, a young man named Nacht. He was not a king or anything important like that. He was an ordinary fella, and it was very interesting to see what his life was like and the kind of problems that ordinary people faced in ancient times. Since then, we've also had the very first CAT scan of a mummy, and that was Knott's brain a long time ago. And more recently, a mummy named Jedma Atazank, one of the most beautiful mummy cases around. She's had her CAT scan too, and we were horrified to find out that she had died of some very nasty dental issues, probably an abscessed tooth. Every time I think about Jedma Atazank, I want to run right out and floss. Here's my friend Dr. Andrew Nelson, from the University of Western Ontario, who's worked with me on some mummy projects and is working on mummy projects now. Andrew, can you take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Gayle, and it's great to be here with everybody. My name is Andrew Nelson. I'm an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Western Ontario. And I've come to join Gayle and the rest of the ROM researchers and very fortunate to be able to pick up on this rich history of mummy studies, and particularly the application of scientific techniques. And the scans that Gayle referred to, the scan of Knott's brain and then the first full body scan of Jedma Atazank in the world were really cutting edge applications of that technology back in the 1970s and 1980s. And so the work that I've been doing with Gayle, and we've now got our third compatriot here involved with, is using newer generation CT scanners to study more of the mummies from the Royal Ontario Museum. And we're hoping to be able to pick up on some of the animal mummies that are in the ROM's collection, and also to pick up more of the human mummies, and even go back and revisit Jedma Atazank, because it's been 30 years, something like that, since she was scanned, and the technology is a lot better now. But a lot of the sorts of things that we're looking for on the mummies are things like how they were mummified, as well as how they died, which is what Gayle was talking about. And Drew has been a big part of the exercise in the systematic study of how the ancient Egyptians were mummified. So Drew, why don't you take over?
Certainly. My name's Andrew Wade at the McMaster University. I did my graduate work at Western University under Andrew. For the sake of the people asking questions, it's probably easiest to differentiate us as I'm Drew and Dr. Nelson is Andrew. We've been doing that game for a while now. And yeah, so Andrew Nelson sucked me into the mummy game while I was doing my grad work with him at Western, and we started putting together a big, large-scale database for looking at the scans and the X-rays of mummies, so that we could stop just looking at 1 or 2 mummies in a museum, and maybe look at whole populations of mummies and how they change over time in different areas of Egypt and eventually different areas of the world, because we have mummification happening in different ways all over the planet, on every inhabited continent for the last 9,000 or 10,000 years at least. And then since then, I've gone on to do a bit more online work. So we're putting together the Mummipedia project and trying to get all of you folks to help us find out where all the mummies are in the world and what's been done to them.
I could add an interesting thing in there. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
No, Gayle, you're up.
Okay. Well, I was thinking about how mummies can be in very strange places. Andrew Nelson has worked on a mummy we call Lady Hudson, because we don't know her real name, but she was actually in a barn north of Ottawa for quite a long time, and nevertheless survived her treatment up there, and end up being a very interesting member of your department, I think.
Yes, indeed. Lady Hudson is, I suspect, the oldest student at Western University. Yeah, her story is a long and complicated one, but to give you a thumbnail of that, the first we know of her is back in the 1960s in a museum in Belgium that went broke, and a collector in Ottawa managed to buy her and managed to bring her into Canada, which probably finessed the custom system to be able to do that. But she was in this private collection with suits of armor and stuffed animals and all sorts of wonderful things. But when he died, the family passed the collection along to the Ottawa Carleton School Board, where the stuffed animals and Lady Hudson did indeed reside in this barn for something like 20 years. And then the Canadian Museum of Civilization picked her up for a traveling exhibit, and she was seen by, I believe, something like 500,000 people all around North America. And to sort of cut through the story, they decided that really she should be in a proper museum. And she got partway there into the Royal Ontario Museum, but for a variety of reasons, they decided not to take her into their collections, and she resided in a closet for quite a while until Gayle's group of Egyptology people in Toronto, in particular, a connection in Chatham, tracked me down, and literally there was a phone call one day and it's saying, "Hey Andrew, do you want a mummy?" And so I said, "Well, sure." And so Lady Hudson now resides in our department, and she's been the focus of lots of interesting study by students over the years, and most recently we've been doing some absolutely cutting-edge work with some other people here in London, and drew on the application of magnetic resonance imaging to the mummy. And you're not really supposed to be able to do MR imaging on mummies because it works on the basis of spinning around water molecules in your body, and there are none left in a mummy, or there aren't supposed to be. So Drew, why don't you pick up on that and talk a little bit about what the interesting sorts of things that we're seeing there?
Yeah, well, as Andrew said, it's something we haven't been able to do up until very recently. People have been trying to do MRIs of mummies, and usually you just get a big image of nothing, because there's not a lot of water molecules left in the body to excite and get a signal from and see structures. So a couple of years ago, though, someone started applying I think it was an experimental technique that was really meant for materials testing or something like that, and it let us actually do some MRI with dry, desiccated mummies. So the Egyptians, of course, fall into that. A lot of mummies do. We used to be able to use MRI for things like bog bodies, where actually the bones are gone, but the skin and all the soft tissue has been tanned by the bog. It's like instead of beef jerky, they're like a fruit roll, and so we can get some signal out of them, but not with the dried Egyptian mummies. And we're starting to look at things now, like if it looks like if we see one appearance in the CAT scan, which tells us about the density of materials in the body, and we see a different appearance in the MRI, which tells us about the presence of water and other elements, then we can start to pick apart some of the tissues that are in there. We had a look at a cat mummy that still had some blood that we think in the body still, and it shows up very brightly on the CT scan, because dried blood, like a blood clot, is going to be very dense. But in an MRI, it doesn't show up at all, because there's no water left in that what used to be blood and in those structures. So we get a little bit more out of the scans by comparing them between the different types of scans than we do from any one scan or any looking at it in any one particular way.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the new things you've discovered or the additional information we have about embalming practices by using this new technology?
Well, the cat that Drew is referring to is a cat that we mummified here in my lab a few years ago. This is the faithful cat named Yes, who belonged to one of the department's graduate students. And Yes died after 21 years of well, he didn't have pancreatitis for 21 years. He was 21 years old and died of pancreatitis. And so Frank came to me and said, would I mummify Yes for him? And it just so happened to be, it was the same year that we had just started our PhD program, and the same year that we took in Lady Hudson. So this was actually an excellent opportunity for us to study the mummification process. So we scanned Yes, and before we started mummifying him, and then we did the 70 days in natron and changing the natron religiously over the time. And we scanned him after that time, and then we scanned him several years after that, and then finally we scanned him 8 years after that. And at that point we gave Yes back to Frank, and he now resides happily with Frank. But we were able to discern a number of things. First of all, that the muscle tissues lose their fluid very quickly, and so a lot of the shrinkage and desiccation that you see on mummified or desiccated things is from that very rapid muscle water loss, whereas the fat seems to retain its water much longer, and that's quite interesting. And so I think this may ultimately help us to tell something about the actual mummification process and the conditions under which it took place. But this also ties in with the MRI work that Drew was referring to. The cat with the clot is in fact Yes. And so what we're hoping we can do is actually borrow Yes back from Frank, and do a needle biopsy to try and capture some of that blood from the heart, and actually do some pathological lab-based workup on that. So here we can actually essentially term that air photo people use that we're ground truthing what we see on the scans by actually seeing what's actually going on, and that's really quite important, because when we look at the scans, lots of different things can give the same sort of image. So we want to be really sure that we know what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and lots of different materials in the body. Because things get dried up, it starts to become hard looking at just a CT scan, just a CAT scan, to tell, what's wrapping and what's skin and what's fat and what's bone, because they're all glommed on together. And as they dry out, they get really quite dense, so they get hard to tell apart from one another. And when we start looking at them with different techniques, then we can, some materials are going to look just a little bit different, and we can start to get the computer to separate those for us automatically. And some work's been done with that, with some collaborators at the Robarts Research Institute there at Western, with a system where we take a scan in a couple of different energy levels in the same CT scanner. So X-rays with a little more energy or a little less energy will interact with materials a little bit differently, and we can just plug those numbers into a program, and it helps us separate the materials and the tissues in the body.
I was just thinking that one of the interesting things about your work and Andrew's work is that we're finding out how mummification was really done in, as you've said, many, many cultures. In most books about ancient Egypt, people repeat endlessly what a Greek named Herodotus said 2,400 years ago. And the question has always been, well, was that really how they did it? And I guess every child knows that there are 4 canopic jars, and one canopic jar has the lungs, and one has the liver, and one has the stomach, and one has the intestines, and that's the way it's always done. And I think you're finding out now that there wasn't one way or even 3 ways of mummifying people. And I'm thinking especially of one of our mummies here at the museum, since we didn't know her real name. we called her Justine. Could you talk maybe a little bit about Justine?
Well, I'll jump in and talk a little bit about Justine, but the Herodotus work is really, that was Drew's dissertation, so I'll pass that along to him to work with. But yeah, Justine was one of 3 mummies that I and colleagues here in London borrowed from the ROM, and we brought them up to London for a number of different experiments with different kinds of scanning techniques. And the most remarkable thing about Justine was, Herodotus said that, well, there are a number of remarkable things, but Herodotus said the brain was removed through the nose, and then the organs were removed, and except the heart was left, and that sort of stuff. But Justine, her brain was still there, so it had not been removed. Looking at the scan, you could see that her abdominal skin had retracted quite a bit from the wrappings, which suggested that she wasn't entirely desiccated when they wrapped her, and so further desiccation occurred after that. So that's kind of interesting in terms of whether she was actually 70 days in natron, and I kind of doubt it actually. But the other thing was she was cleaned out from tongue to stomach. All the organs were gone, the heart and everything. And as opposed to going through a nice incision in the left-hand side, as the tradition says they were supposed to do, the opening was actually through the perineum. So it was an opening that joined the vagina and the anus, and they just went up and cleaned everything out. And that's not a technique that's described in most Egyptological textbooks. But Drew, why don't you talk about a little bit more about Herodotus stuff?
That's the sort of story that makes my wife love you so much. And it is. We're talking about the way that people treated the dead, thousands of years ago, and we have substantially different ideas about what's acceptable to do to a human body now than they did then, and for different cultural reasons. But Herodotus has, I think, become my arch enemy for. And did during the time I was doing my dissertation, because so much of the literature, and it just the popular literature that you see too, the regular mummy books, but also the stuff that we're consuming as academics, relies so heavily on the accounts by this fellow, who, I mean, as esteemed as he may be in some circles, is little more than an ancient tourist, and bringing back stories, in some cases, and probably in many cases, second-hand stories from people, and he may have repeated them with some sense of this is you should be skeptical about it. He doesn't really say that, and ever since then, he's one of those great old Greeks that we have to respect and listen to. So he says things like, all the mummies will have the brain removed through the nose. And have the internal organs removed through a little incision in the left-hand side of the body, and that's not the case. We see all sorts of variation. Some of them had their brains left in, some of them had them removed. Whether you went up through the nose or not is a question too. There are some. I haven't seen any really good evidence yet, but there's some indication that they may have been going in through the hole in the base of the skull, where the spinal cord communicates from the brain to the spine, and removing the brain that way. So that would be some variation that he had no knowledge of. And then when we talk about the body, he had a bunch of different ideas about it being removed through an incision, or you would pump cedar oil up through their bum, and that would dissolve all the organs. And that is actually a funny one, because we don't see any evidence of that happening in human mummies, but it is something that happens in the bull mummies. And we actually have, for the bull mummies, because they're only being, they're fairly long-lived animals. These were sacred animals that were worshipped by the cult, by a couple of cults in ancient Egypt. And they only had to be mummified 2 or 3 times a generation. So the embalmers actually had to write down the instructions for that, as opposed to humans who they were doing on a regular basis, and it was a bit of a family secret on how you did that. You didn't want everyone to know, or everyone to become an embalmer, I suppose. Well, maybe not. But they had to write down some instructions, and we see some indication of like large enema rigs for dissolving the internal organs of these bulls. And I think because Herodotus thinks that this is what they did to sort of the lowest rung of people that were getting mummified, sort of the cheapest option. And I think he got a little bit confused about a story that, he sort of thought, well, if that's how they do it for animals, that's probably the way they do it for the cheapest way for humans. And we don't see that in humans, though, at all. So, it's a lot of variability out there, and Herodotus is not always right by any stretch.
But Drew, talk a little bit about the patterning of the variability, though, particularly the change over time.
Yeah, well, we get to see not just how they're doing it, but who's getting it done. Round about the New Kingdom, round about Tut's time, before that, instead of just the pharaohs or just the nobles getting mummified, then we see what you could probably call a bit more ordinary people being mummified. They were people who could afford it, because it's not cheap to have an embalmer turn you into a mummy. And we start to see a transition from things that are just for the pharaoh to expanded to maybe the noble family and some of the nobles and governors and things like that, and eventually on to middle-class people, middle-class Egyptians, being able to be mummified. And that changes over time as well. Once more people can be mummified, then the people who are really at the top of the ladder want to be mummified in ways that distinguish them from the rest of the riffraff who are being mummified. So we start to see other materials being added to the body, like expensive tree resins from imported wood, being added to. Once you remove the brain, then you put some resin in to fill that cavity, or resin being added to the body cavity. It's a bit of an arms race of mummification features.
So Gayle, why don't you give us some of your thoughts about the role that mummies play in education, but also in the public imagination. That's a lot of your sort of realm.
It is indeed. I guess one of the interesting things is how popular mummies are. When people come to a museum like the Royal Ontario Museum, they ask, where are the mummies and where are the dinosaurs? Sometimes in the other order. And you think, well, why do you want to see a dead body? You can understand seeing a giant monster like a dinosaur, but the dead bodies are very important because I think in our culture we hide death. Very often we don't view a body. Bodies are very often cremated. We don't want to know much about death in our culture. We don't go into obvious mourning. And so a mummy gives us a chance to actually say hello to death and realize this is where we're all going in the end. And to notice that in ancient Egypt, they took a long time to say goodbye to people. And they wanted that final goodbye to be something really special. The funerals were quite intricate affairs. They didn't really want to say goodbye, go away forever. They wanted to keep the dead with them. They thought that the dead could still help us, and we could still help them. And they wanted to keep the bond, that family bond. And I think when we meet mummies in museums, it's a chance for us to reflect on our own dead, the people we love who have gone beyond. And just to think about all those generations between us and them, many, many generations between us and the ancient Egyptians, and that we can look on their faces, we can know about their dental problems, we can see an awful lot about how they lived and died. It's a wonderful thing to be able to meet a mummy.
It's great from our standpoint, too, that people are so interested. As I mentioned the Mummipedia project. That's, it's because people are so interested in mummies and, they can go out to museums and see them firsthand, that now we can use sort of everybody to do some research. We can, everyone can help us know a little bit more about what's out there. And as I said, we don't want to just study one or two mummies because that doesn't tell us about how things changed and what, it meant to be mummified for one type of person versus another type of person or a different area. We really want to know as much as we can from as many different mummies as we can. And, if we see, if the public can help us know where all the mummies are, what's been done to them, then we can spend our time more wisely too and figure out, which ones haven't been scanned yet, which ones are worth having a look at with this, medical imaging technologies. That that really is important for us, and it's something, because people are so interested in mummies, that that they want to do.
Can I? Oh, I was just going to. Oh, go ahead. I was going to ask you both. Do you think that the study of mummies is a hobby for some of us who are just curious, or do you think it really helps us to understand something about the history of medicine? Do you think it's a valuable study from that point of view?
It's a valuable study from a whole variety of perspectives. I mean, for one thing, I mean, yes, it is inherently fascinating, and we're very lucky to be able to do what we do. But I think it tells us a lot about ancient Egypt, and ancient Egypt is a very important culture at the root of the complex civilizations that ultimately led to our own today. And so I think the more that we know about the Egyptians or the Greeks or any of those people really informs us about cultural process and progress. But to address specifically the question about health, we have a group of colleagues working in the U.S. who have been recently studying atherosclerosis, so hardening of the arteries. They started in Egyptian mummies, but they've expanded their sample to mummies from all over the world. And they've been finding that atherosclerosis, which we generally thought to be a disease of the sort of Big Mac, fat, heavy consumption modern generation, in fact, is not at all uncommon in ancient civilizations. It certainly didn't have Big Macs. And in fact, it did not probably have a very fat, heavy diet at all. And one of their conclusions is that this probably had a lot to do simply with the aging process. And it seems to be that it's the older mummies that have the atherosclerosis. There may be a couple other explanations, but that's certainly one. And there have been some other examples of people finding examples of cancer in mummies, and so far the atherosclerosis is great. It's a systematic study of I think there are probably 60, 70, 100 mummies, something like that they've looked at. We're also assembling a database of CT scans of mummies because, as Drew has noted a couple times, there are lots of little case study examples where there's a one-off here and a one-off there, but we really want to start addressing these kinds of questions in a systematic way, and so it's only with a large-scale database that you can actually do that.
Yeah. And I mean, we study mummies for all the same reasons that we study human remains in physical anthropology in general. Andrew and I are both physical anthropologists, and we study the bones to know more about how our cultures have been and continue to change, what sorts of diseases people had in the past, and when we get into larger numbers, we can start looking in the same way that we do in modern medicine at what types of people are more likely to be affected by diseases. Is it more common in women? Is it more common in older people? And when we have the mummies, we don't just have the bones, we have all the soft tissue, well, a lot of the soft tissues. The Egyptians pulled a lot of the organs out, but we have all sorts of other information we can gather. And then as we do all these high-tech studies of mummies, we're helping the medical, like the medical researchers push the boundaries on their imaging technologies. And we use rapid prototyping technologies, this 3D printing that actually is coming into people's homes now in a greater and greater degree. And these are all technologies we can use, and as we use them, we help figure out what they can do and what new things they could do in other fields as well.
We've got our 3D printers just being delivered this afternoon, so we're really looking forward to that.
Oh.
So we've been experimenting a little bit with 3D printing here at the ROM. What specifically will you do with them? What are your plans?
Well, one of the things that we've been involved in is what's called segmenting out the skull. That means you actually sort of separate the skull out from the rest of it, and then make a 3D print of the skull. And we've been working with forensic artists to reconstruct the face of the skull of the individual, and that's really exciting because that really sort of brings the person to life. You know, you can actually look at their face, and that's a very exciting development. To be able to use the technology to we don't want to tear the mummy apart. That's the whole idea, and so we can use the CT non-destructively to pull out the skull and then use the 3D printing to make a copy.
So we're just at the end of our time here. I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to share that hasn't come out yet. Anything more you want to say about future research, or?
Well, one of the before we get to future research, just one thing I would like to say is that really this kind of work is teamwork, and there's no single individual who can make this happen. You know, Gayle's there at the ROM. We're here at the universities. We interact with the forensic artists and with medical doctors and imaging physicists and you name it. And so this kind of research is definitely a team effort, and that's really important. In terms of where we want to go, more mummies, and we're very keen. We're constantly badgering Gayle's bosses to see if we can get some more of the mummies out, and I think that would be a great way to celebrate the upcoming ROM centennial. So maybe Gayle can talk a little bit about what she would like to see from that.
Well, I would certainly like to see all your lovely technology applied to some of our old friends. There's a little girl named Nesmut. I would like to see some work done on her, just to find out what this pretty little girl died of so long ago. She died when she was about 11, I'd say, somewhere between 8 and 11. Lovely little girl. What happened to her? And, of course, our old friend Aunt Jao that I started with, who's been in Canada for 150 years, sure would be nice to know just a little bit more about him.
And I'd like to push that team effort out into the rest of the world and have you all help us figure out what's going on with the mummies and do some research of your own, because once that information is up on the web and you can just access it like you do Wikipedia, then you can do research as well in the same way that we do and help us learn more.
That's great. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us. This has been really fascinating. We'll be having our next Google Plus Hangout. It's going to be on February 12th at 1 p.m. And we'll have Kate Cooper joined with several colleagues who will be talking about recent research into an ivory figurine we have here at the ROM. And the question is she really a Minoan goddess or not? So Kate's been investigating that. That's February 12th at 1 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.